Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael. It's so good to be in this space and so good to share with you all. I'm a huge fan of Michael's work. Michael recently, I just had to say that. There was your piece that you did with antisocial behavior and trying to like uncover the extent of it that you all did. It was probably a couple years ago. I think you all presented that at CSCW. And I wish I loved that piece. I wish I had that piece 10 years ago. I was like, I needed this 10 years ago. Because I think, as a qualitative researcher and scholar, I don't do statistics, I don't do the quantitative stuff. And so usually when I'm in spaces trying to talk about like a problem, folks always say, well, what's the extent of the problem? And I couldn't, and I didn't have it. And I think I was doing this work a little bit too early, before, I know Pew Research has done some stuff. We got data, we got numbers now, right? And I love that piece so much. So I love sharing that and adding that and talking about that whenever, folks want to talk about like trolling and, looking at like antisocial behaviors inside spaces. So it's wonderful work, Michael. And I'm so glad to share space with y'all. Thanks for having me. It's so great. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I never know where to start with these things, because there are so many different ways where I can, take these conversations and first, I'm really glad to be able to share space with folks like you all, especially, comp sci engineering folks, because, we speak different languages, I think that's one of the things that I love, that we're sharing space so we can kind of talk with each other instead of like over and across each other. A few, when intersectional tech first came out, there was a computer science professor at Yale, a lovely human being, but he laughed at how I was talking about algorithms in my book, Intersectional Tech. And I think, he was laughing because I think he realized the disconnect that happens like when people are trying to make sense of algorithms and like what algorithms like actually are. And I think that like, and what he had shared, there was an excerpt in Intersectional Tech where there were some Black men talking with one another. And I think that they were on social media and they were getting like a bunch of like spammy kind of content. And somebody made the comment inside that chat that said, well, you got to get your algorithms right. So, it's one of these lessons where we think that we can manipulate like the algorithm, right? Where we think that our choices and our behaviors and the things that we do, and that we have control of an algorithm ourselves, right? And so it was really interesting, when Professor Kim, the CS professor at Yale, he was like, no, that's not how any of this works, so it was really good just to hear that. But I think that there is really what's important is that when people don't have like the answers or they don't know the how or why of something, the human brain will fill in the blanks, automatically, based off if it's real, imagined or perceived, our brains will interpret things, and we will fill in like a lot of those blanks. So I feel like a lot of my work is kind of like that in between space of things are happening on the technical side, on the infrastructure side, on the system side, and then these users have no idea like what's happening, and then so they're expressing themselves, and especially now they're using social media to kind of talk about what they're seeing and what they're feeling and experiencing. And I think there's like a lot of value in that I think the industry, hopefully the industry is starting to pay more attention to. And beautiful folks like you all, you all are able to to interact and to contribute in those spaces, like so because you all are like a part of also like the bridging of the gap, for like folks like me and like industry, because you all are going to go in there in beautiful ways. I have some slides here. I can share them, but if y'all have seen me talk, I'm terrible with PowerPoint. I'll go off on a tangent. I'll just go somewhere and it's neither here nor there. So just follow along. Here's some of my books. Yeah, I can tell I like color. I like colorful books. That actually was incongruent with publishing for a long time, because I know there are a lot of these publishers are like, no, we don't want all those colors. This is a simple book. But so I advocated and I fought for colors on these books. They're eye popping. But I wanted to, a lot of my work really is like situated on just this convergence and this conflation and the collapsing of like boundaries, between people and spaces and the technologies that they use. So I really like looking at like this hybrid space of like, where do we meet, when we're on our online and offline selves, what's like that hybrid space, like of what we create and what we do and what we make and how we think about the world. And so my early work was really focused on, I was in gaming spaces trying to figure out, the gaming technology was innovative and it was going so fast, and just seeing how people like connected with it. Some of that early work really focused on like, there's a theory, the diffusion of innovation theory, that's near and dear to my heart. It's one of my favorite, but I really wanted to think about, how does our identity influence like the ways that we like adopt technologies and how we use these technologies. And of course there was, there are a lot of this research influenced like digital divide scholarship, of where, we talk about, race matters, gender matters, like our economic situations matter, class matters, right? And so I was really fascinated at because I also, during that time, this is like grad school, it's like 2007, 2008. I remember reading something, and basically a lot of that scholarship was kind of situating Black folks as like the poster children for the digital divide. And that was just incongruent with my reality of what I knew about the spaces that I was occupying, what I knew about folks who were inside those spaces. I'm like, we aren't the poster children. Actually, Black folks are pretty savvy. And this was actually also like a few years after the Million Woman March. I know we don't talk about the Million Woman March that much, but it was done after the Million Man March, and it was in the 90s, and it showcased just the techno savviness of like Black women, like to be connected like with networks. They organized an entire rally using fax machines, and so I thought it was like really interesting and really cool, just how they were using like the technologies that were like afforded to them, right? And so I think a lot of my work just really wanted to put marginalized, minoritized folks, back into the conversation, so we can see what have they contributed, what have they said, how have they utilized these technologies. And so that piece that I did around like diffusion of innovation, I wanted to see how do we learn new technologies? How do we adapt to the changes, like especially like with the continued changes like around technology? How are we adapting to that? So in the diffusion of innovation, like literature, there are, folks who are like early adopters, and then there are like people who are called like laggards, right? I'm sure they've probably updated these terms by now, but I was fascinated by that. And seeing as how, Black and brown folks are really savvy in like these gaming spaces, it was just interesting just to see, how they came into the space and why they stay in a space that may not be a space that was created for them, especially with the continued advances of like this technology. And whenever, folks started talking with one another, and, the spaces got, pretty trolly real quickly, you got pretty racist pretty quickly, but then people stayed, so I became fascinated and just trying to make sense of, of the communities that people created inside those spaces, how they connect with one another, and also then why they stay. But in that piece that I focused on, I realized that there are some folks who you would call like the interlocutors or the interlopers, like in the space, these folks who were like the early adopters, and then they share that information with other folks. So there was this one person in particular, if anybody's read my work, it's the character, I think it's Smith and Wesson. He is the person who, he has the resources, like to go to the conferences, to go to like the E3s when E3 existed, whatever's happening with E3 now, my goodness. So he had the means to go to those spaces, and then he would bring back those information to the community, and it would disperse it in really interesting ways. And he got more savvy with it as social media, when thinking about like convergence. But whenever social media started to permeate in gaming spaces, it became a lot easier for him to then share that information. So he's built like this pretty big platform of where he is like this gaming guru, really, like for Black and brown communities. It's really beautiful. But what I also, something else that kind of anchors my work, I talked to you about how I'm situated like in this hybrid space of where, I'm fascinated with the offline meeting, like the online, and seeing what gets created in there. But I just recognize the importance of the physical space, IRL. I recognize that it's a space that's not neutral. So there's really no way that we can create these neutral experiences, these neutral technologies, because of course, and this scholarship is everywhere now, because we bring, all of these, we bring in our assumptions, we bring in our biases, we bring in, the world in which we exist and we live in. We bring our perspectives inside that. And then but because it's like a technical space, it's not the same. And so we refashion it and remix it in a really particular way. One of the things that, an example that I'll talk about that some of you have heard me speak, I talk a lot about this Pokemon Go example. And that is really just this amazing, for those of you who know Pokemon Go, it's this geolocation service that you use, like mobile technologies, right? And so it's this really interesting space that allows me to really just think through all of these things just in that one place. I'll talk about it in just a second. Also, just to get folks up to speed about, like my background, in the Kai Talk, for those that may have heard the Kai Talk, I talk about how gaming is like this canary in the coal mine, and that if we would have paid more attention to like what was happening in the gaming space, we could have preemptively solved like some of the issues and the problems that we have now. I love talking about the Connect. The Connect came out in 2009, and the Connect, the Connect only wanted to play with certain bodies and certain people, right? The Connect didn't read bigger bodies. The Connect didn't read folks like that had darker skin. If somebody had like it wouldn't read like if you had like larger breasts, it wouldn't read like your chest area. It was really just a space that was made and created, by a particular like demographic, right? And so it was really interesting, when people were, blowing the whistle on this, and how many folks like just weren't really like paying attention. They were like, no, your lighting's bad. You just don't have enough space. And it was after that talk, somebody came up to me. He said he worked on the Connect. He was really, I don't think he did. Nobody knew him. But he came up to me and he was telling me how the Connect actually worked. And he confirmed what I was saying, so I mean, even thinking about like Michael's shirt right now. Michael has on a black shirt. The Connect in those days would not have read or rendered his body. It would have just had him, he would have just been like a head, kind of like floating in like the multiverse or whatever, so it was just really interesting how far along we've come. But if we would have paid a little bit more attention there, then we would have been ahead of the conversation around like body recognition, racial, facial recognition. And we would have been able to not be shocked by what's happening like with Project Greenlight in Detroit, or, we wouldn't have been shocked about, Alexa, making these inappropriate jokes, right? We would have been like, well, yeah, the technology is like a reflection of like all of our biases because we're building and we're embedding them in there. I'm even thinking about Microsoft Tay. Y'all remember the chat bot that Microsoft had, right? I don't know why we were shocked then. Like, of course, this is what's going to happen when you let loose like this learning machine that's going to go onto Twitter. She's going to learn those things because that's how like people operate, and that's how people like speak and interact in those kinds of spaces. But I really think gaming gave us like a good little platform so we can think about, what the spaces might look like. All of these things, I'm trying to like go real quick and catch everybody up. A lot of the work that I did led me to this framework of like intersectional game design. Because when I talk to a lot of these companies, they're always asking, well, Kishonna, all that is well and good in theory. That's nice. It's good to know that. But how can we put this like into practice, right? And so I always, ask the question like, well, when you're creating these experiences, like who are you creating them for? Like who's your audience? Like you're not creating universal experiences because you're still going to exclude some folks, right? And so I think that these gaming companies have to be intentional about who they're creating things for. And they actually should just say, these folks, it wasn't designed with that person in mind. It wasn't designed with disabled people in mind. And because I think if we're thinking intersectionally, we're also thinking about accessibility. Can everybody play this game? And if everybody can't play this game, you have to, I think a company should, operating from like an ethic of care, they should actually articulate, those kinds of things. That's what an intersectional game game design will call for. And also in thinking about like aesthetics, we have to think about what things look. We have to think about the sound and the haptic experiences and the sonic experiences and the mechanical aesthetics. I was spending a little bit of time like with karma scales early in my life, and I'm like, these decisions just make no sense. Why would you create like decision-making trees with like these decisions like in mind? There was a game I was playing, Infamous Second Son, of where basically we have the main character, we have to make a decision to save ourselves or to save or like if we save ourselves, it would destroy like an entire tribe. And I'm like, what's the purpose in that? Thinking about like frameworks, Hawkins, I can't remember their first name, but Hawkins has a really interesting and powerful framework, that ludonarrative dissonance, that allows me to help really make sense of these design choices inside a game, of where, those decision-making has nothing to do with like the gameplay, and how those are like incongruent with one another, and they really make no sense. And so I think it's really important for folks who are designing these experiences like to think about that, like, will this design choice like impact then like the narrative? And another example, I should have put this up there, The Last of Us. Anybody play the game The Last of Us? I wish I could see the whole room. I can't see everybody, but so The Last of Us is a really interesting experience. So towards the end of The Last of Us 2, I believe, it's the interaction with Nora. So you're Ellie and Nora, and you fall in, and Ellie is the character where she's immune, she can be around, like the zombies, and she's not gonna get the disease that everybody else is getting because she's immune to this. And so Ellie is a character who's there in the space. They fall into like the spores den with the zombies. And then but they were battling, they were fighting. But basically, Ellie ends up killing Nora. And then basically we have to like press X as we're like hacking and slicing her. And I'm just like, this is wild. Like just the visceralness of that was just incongruent. I'm like, there was no need for us, like just have the death happen. There's no need for us to like press X to like engage with that. I don't think a lot of designers really think deeply about those kinds of choices. Battlefield 1 is also this beautiful experience. Usually it's easier just to QR code that. So if you can QR code that's going to take you to a YouTube channel of the opening scene of this game, Battlefield 1. Now, I think it's a beautiful experience. If you have some time to like look at it, or just kind of listen to me as it's and just keep it on mute. But I was excited about this game because it's the first time that I think like a Black regiment was featured like on a AAA studio, kind of game. And so I was just, and it's the Harlem Hellfighters, who are a very successful in terms, if you can be successful in war, you all know what I mean. So sorry, but they were a successful, regiment of Black and Puerto Rican men who fought in World War I. Now, when I played this game, I was excited, and knowing shooters, I thought he was just going to be one of multiple characters that we could play, and we would engage, with his narrative. But what they actually did was create hyper visible death. There was so much Black death in that opening because you start with one character and then the game kills you. Like, so I remember as I was playing this game in my lab when I was at Eastern Kentucky University. And so we were playing this game, but we recognized that, as soon as we went out, the shots were immediate and instant. It took a while for us to generate our health back. So the game was designed to kill us, right? And then because they basically wanted to showcase this memoriam that they had designed. So when you die, a name pops on the screen and you're celebrating or honoring like this person's like death. Now this game came out in 2016, so the optics are terrible, right? Remember when I was talking about authentic experience, like who are these experiences for? So in 2016, this was like really at the height of the movement for Black lives. I think a couple of things that, and so when this game comes out, you're basically witnessing like the final moments of like this Black person's life, right? And it was really hard to like engage in that amount of like Black death that was out of your control. And so I likened it to the other things that we were seeing on social media of like hashtag Black death everywhere, of where you have this hyper visibility, you know, this trauma porn, you know, almost, you know, that's like happening. And then the game created this experience for us, right? And so here in this moment where we wanted to celebrate it, it was just hard to, given the overwhelmingness of the emotions and the death in that game. Some of the other things, there's no segue in any of this. I'm just kind of giving you like a hodgepodge of all my work and what I'm interested in. I got really interested in reporting structures as well. Shifting gears here. I got interested in reporting structures because whenever I started most of my work, I still am. Most of my work is in the console gaming space, you know, so I don't really do much like in the PC space. I think that there's so much beauty and value, especially in a console, you know, because it's not a computer, but it's not just a video game, you know, it's this really remarkable dynamic, you know, multi-mediated experience that serves, you know, a particular function, right? So I was really interested in the early days of my work where, you know, folks were talking about the sexism and the racism that they experience. And I'm because I'm big, you know, I guess I'm kind of platform studies. I don't know. I don't know names. I don't know labels. I just do work and I just do me. But I was really fascinated in how one would go about reporting harms that happen to them in a game, right? And so I spent some time, you know, across PlayStation and Xbox, you know, those two, the big two consoles, right? I spent time across those two, just looking at the reporting systems, looking at the language that was there and there on those reporting systems. And they say a lot, right? I think a lot of people assume that these reporting systems are neutral. There's a lot of valuation here. And valuation, I mean like a value system. You know, this indicates what a platform cares about, what matters to them. So this is one of the early reporting systems like an Xbox, right? And so if we were to go in and report somebody, I can report for spam, I can report for their bio or their location, I can report for cheating, their player name or gamer tag, picture, quitting early, unsporting behavior, and voice communication, right? And so I was fascinated at how these are designed. I was fascinated at the language that's used, because I think that, you know, these phrases are doing a lot of work, but they're doing very little, right? Early on, voice communication actually was added much later, right? Because a voice chat came later in a lot of these systems, right? It wasn't one of the, I think voice chat in Xbox came, I think around like 2004, but the game it was live. I can't remember. It went live and a few years later, voice chat. But anyway, and also now there's an option for gender-based harassment that came after Gamergate, you know, the harassment campaign like against women inside the gaming space. So there's an option for gender-based harassment. But for the longest time, there were only options to like report cheating. Now that lets you know what a platform cares about. If they're like, okay, we got to do something about the cheating in this space. And so I was asking and trying to reach out to try to find out, well, if somebody experiences a sexism or a racism, where do they go? And voice communication came in there. And so people said, well, you can report in voice communication, and a whole host of other options like come up. But I think that there is a disconnect in how people might explain or describe the experiences that they're having in a space. So I remember harassment was an option that came up eventually. I think probably 2016 or 2017. I think you can see harassment. And what I realized, and I didn't anticipate, was that there's going to be some racial differences in how people make sense of harassment. So when I was talking to Black women in particular, they never would have described the things that they were experiencing in that space as harassment. They and I thought that was interesting. I was like, so whenever you experience sexism in the space, you know, if people are, you know, asking you to make sandwiches or perform sexual favors, you know, things like that, how would you describe that? one woman actually said, she said, well, that's just fuck boy shit. I ain't reporting that because it's not, I'm used to it. It's like such a normal thing. So here are a couple things that were like, I'm trying to basically coalesce in my mind. They wouldn't have used the language of harassment, but they had also normalized their experience to the point where they didn't even utilize the reporting systems. So there's no way to get this information, to the stakeholders in the space, to the platforms in the space. Because I even remember there was a few years ago where Xbox had even put out like a press release that said, we don't have an issue of racism in our space. Because there's like this culture of like, well, this is normal. It always happens. And the system's not going to do anything about it. And so here we are like inside this loop. And I'm like, this can't be reality. This can't be right. Right. Let's fast forward a little bit. Okay, I didn't do this right. Fast forward a little bit. There's a game, Friday the 13th. Friday the 13th, it's basically like a copy and paste of the movies. Y'all aren't even old enough to remember Friday the 13th. I think they've had like reboots. Yes, Mike, yes, you're not. So it's like legit copy and paste. And it was beautiful. I was so excited. My 80s kid self was very looking forward to this, right? So when we were playing Friday the 13th, you can play as a counselor or you play as some of the Jasons. They have different iterations of Jason. So one of the iterations of Jason is the part 2 Jason. That's the Jason that has the pillowcase over his head. And sadly, he got co-opted by some folks of ill will inside the gaming space. So they use him as like a Klan member Jason, like he's like the KKK. And this is like his Klan hood that he's got on his head. Now, during this time, talk a lot about the different innovations inside the space. Xbox had just introduced a feature where you can utilize hashtags to find other folks to play with. So one of the hashtags that was created was hashtag Make Crystal Lake Great Again, where people of ill will would go in and play together and utilize Klan member Jason and kill all of the characters of color and the women. And so the researcher in me was like, of course, I'm not shocked at this. The human in me was like, I'm not shocked. The researcher in me was like, I'm fascinated. I want to know more about this. So I reached out to the folks who were like, utilizing, Klan part 2 Jason, and asking them, why are you doing this? Why are you engaging in these kinds of behaviors? And so they called me the N-word because I was playing as a Black woman in the game. I was playing as Vanessa. And so, they called me like the N-word. I was like, well, why did you say that? Because I'm just in researcher mode. So again, I'm a person who normalizes all of this, right? Because I've seen it a whole lot and it's sad, but I'm like, these folks are going to make me rich. They're going to give me plenty of content for my next book. So that's the mode I'm operating on. And so I sent a text, I text the person because you can do voice-based chat, you can do text-based chat inside these platforms. So I said, why did you call me? And I spelled out the N-word. I was banned immediately. I was banned. And I'm like, okay, this is surely a mistake because I didn't use the N-word with like any malintention, right? So I'm like, surely there's an easy fix. So I tried to reach out to Xbox enforcement. I don't think there were that many humans behind the scenes here, right? And so I'm like, okay, what is happening here? I remember a few months before, these platforms are always trying to do something to kind of curb the harms that people might experience. And so there was also this trend for a lot of these platforms to go zero tolerance when it comes to racism, but basically all they were going to do is ban the N-word. Now think about like, who are you creating these experiences for? They didn't think that having like a blanket ban on the N-word would negatively impact Black folks who had reclaimed the language and used the N-word in their everyday practices. So you had these huge swaths of Black folks who were getting banned for using like the N-word. And so I'm guessing, there's whatever algorithm or machine learning thing. Like I said, this is y'all stuff. This is not stuff I know. So I'm just telling you all the problems so y'all can help me fix it. But basically they didn't anticipate, they didn't really like acknowledge like the different ways in which the N-word would be used. So they had to fix that. But here I was, a Black person getting banned because the harm had happened to me. And then I was banned in that space. And then I went on Twitter, I popped off, and then I eventually got unbanned. But I was just really fascinated because there was no way to really like report or explain to the system what had happened to me. But then the system, recognized, this like pretty easily. So they're, so if folks are motivated to do things, I realize that stuff is actually possible in this space. How am I for time? Because I can just keep, Michael, that I'll just be talking. I'll forget like all my time.
We're at about noon. We have till 12:30, including discussion. So most speakers will go until like, I don't know, 12:20 or so, 20 minutes, and then we can chat.
Okay, and also just keep an eye on that Google Doc, because if folks are engaging and have like a lot of questions, I don't mind stopping this, so I can hear from you all, and so we can chat with those folks. So just keep me posted on that part, Michael.
Sounds great.
Okay, perfect, good deal. One of the other things that I'm really interested in is like how, of course, part of like the diffusion of innovation, kind of project that I'm doing is looking at pathways like to utilizing like new technologies. And I've really become fascinated with the reliance on mobile technologies and mobile devices. But I'm also fascinated with how like a lot of these new technologies rely on public, the infrastructure in order to support it, and how those things are not always aligned with one another. And so I learned this whenever I was in Chicago. I talked to you all a little bit about Pokemon Go before, but I want to spend a little bit of time telling this, because this is like where I've been thinking about this like a whole lot, trying to put words to it, trying to put some frameworks to it to really make sense of what's happening. So whenever I was in Chicago, I was at the University of Illinois, Chicago, for a little while, right before COVID, during COVID. And so I got connected with some young folks on the south side of Chicago through the public library. So there was like an after school kind of thing happening, because I love doing work with my service work is usually with youth. I actually don't publish scholarship like around the things that I do with youth until this thing happened here. And then I got to go through the IRB process and all that stuff. But anyway, I was fascinated with Pokemon Go for a lot of reasons, right? Is I loved that it got folks back into the physical environment, right? And I told you all, like I exist like at this, where the offline and online meet, like these hybrid spaces. So this was like one of those examples that just allowed me to see, what's happening in that hybrid spaces where the online meets the offline, right? And so I was excited. So I went to the Pokemon Go Fest, and these young folks that I work with on the south side of Chicago invited me there. Sadly, they weren't able to get in because, whenever the city of Chicago and most cities, see groups of Black men, they think there's going to be some malintent on their part, and then they get kind of shooed and pushed away, right? So we had to go back down to the south side because I didn't want them experiencing that anti-Blackness in that way. And from what I knew about Pokemon Go, I'm like, well, we can play this anywhere, right? We don't need to be at this festival in order to play Pokemon Go. I was wrong. So when we went back down to Inglewood, like to play Pokemon Go, there was one stop, and there was one location, and this was actually a Confederate statue in this park on the south side of Chicago. I was just like, ain't no way we're gonna go and hang out with this Confederate statue. It's just not on my watch. And so I looked, reached out to Niantic. In that moment, I went to the Niantic website to see how we can get more PokeGo stops, right? Because I'm like, this is a structural issue. It can be fixed, right? It's a design issue. It can be fixed. And so I noticed that there was like a list of things that made a space eligible. So it has to be a landmark with some significance. There had to be sidewalks, so folks could access it. But then the third one is that it had to be an area that was deemed safe. So given the narratives of what we know about the south side of Chicago, it wasn't going to be a safe space, right? And so because they relied on, police data, hotspot data to generate, this idea of safeness. And I was like, well, surely this can't be reality. So this is when I reached out to Niantic. I'm like, Niantic, y'all got to do something about this, because you might think that you have, this beautiful, however you create your overlay, however you design this experience, the real world is impacting the realities of your digital experiences. So here, especially on the south side of Chicago, we've got legacies of redlining. We've got legacies of housing discrimination. We've got legacies of Jim Crow. We've got all these different kinds of, we've got legacies of like white flight and divestment. I was like, so all of these things are happening and they're not creating equal and equitable like experiences across the map, right? And so what I did, I was like, well, we can kind of create our own the information for our landmarks, because it's Chicago. There's so much beautiful history and so many things that these young folks could actually engage in and can actually do. Where is that? Let's see. Okay, I'm not there yet, my bad. And so the other thing, let me tell you about these maps here. So Pokemon Go, really relies on like the public Wi-Fi, like to operate. And so if you were to look at the city of Chicago, if you were to look at the Wi-Fi hotspot map, like it's full of these blue dots on the north side of the city. And this was that blue dot that's on the left map, that was like our closest Wi-Fi. And so these young folks really were relying on the public infrastructure, the brick and mortar libraries, in order, because if they're around the space and they still have connection, internet connectivity. And so like in the summers and after school, they were really relying on these public infrastructures, which shows the importance of them, right? Especially when you don't have, fiber optics and broadband and Wi-Fi. And whenever the digital infrastructure is not there, we have to rely on the traditional brick and mortar. And so this was like, this project that I thought was necessary to include like the community and into community with, because while we were looking for Pokemon Go stops, yes, we relied on the public library, but we also relied on this organization called MASK. This is Mothers and Men Against Senseless Killing. So anytime people want to talk about like all the murders and death, like in Chicago, they just assume nobody's working to kind of work on that problem. That's just not true. There's so many, committed folks and so many community organizations and like nonprofits that are women-led and Black-led, to do something, to curb like that violence. And this is one of them. But basically what these Black women are doing, they're just occupying, the street corners. They occupy the block to make sure that kids are just safe just across the street. And I think that that's one of those conversations that we don't talk enough about, like in design spaces and tech spaces, of how, they create these experiences, but they don't think about then how is that relaying, how is that then unfolding and manifesting like in these physical spaces where so much of the real world is still happening, like all those things I just said, like that redlining, like Jim Crow, all those things, still matter. So basically what these women would do, like I said, they would just be on the street corners, making sure that kids like cross the street, and they would use walkie-talkies to talk with one another. Say, yes, let's say, a kid like Jerome is at 63rd and then he's trying to get to 64th. And there's somebody that makes sure that he gets there in time and gets there safely. And also back to the library or back to his house. And so I think this is like a really important part of like the work that I'm doing right now, as that goes into like future projects related to, Black game studies, my continued work with like Black cyber feminism, just how important like the people are, to so many of these projects. Let's see. How are we for the questions? Like I can keep talking, Michael, but I can also stop there in case folks might want to like engage and ask some questions.
We're getting some questions, but I think,
let me keep going.
Let's keep going for 10 more minutes and then we'll.
Okay, perfect. Okay, good deal. One of the things that guides like a lot of this work right here, I'm really focused on these geographically isolated populations for a lot of reasons, right? I needed a framework that would let me think about the folks in Appalachia. I'm from Kentucky, I'm born and raised in Kentucky, but it will allow me to think about Appalachia, but it will allow me also to simultaneously think about like, the South side of Chicago. And it would also, make me think about, I spent a lot of time like in Arizona, and I was connected to like a lot of the native and indigenous populations, like on the reservations. So I had to really think about what is like the unifying thread, that kind of help make sense about the exclusionary practices around the technology in these spaces. And I'm like, these populations, they're geographically isolated here, in Arizona, whenever I was working with folks, they're in close proximity to Phoenix, Arizona. That's a city, in the South side of Chicago. That's right there in the Chicagoland, or it's right there in Chicago area. And so, it doesn't make sense, why these populations are still the so-called, poster children of the digital divide, but I'm like, there are some things that are happening to them intentionally. These things are designed intentionally to keep them excluded. And so how do we work around that in order to allow folks to still participate? So here's some of the guiding questions here. So how do geographically isolated populations utilize publicly available tools and technology to develop hybrid networks across communities? I love to see what people piecemeal together in the face of all these exclusionary practices. Like if they don't have internet, if they don't have connectivity, if they don't have this, that, or the other, but then they still participate. I want to examine like the architecture of what allows and enables them to still participate. Another question that guides my work right now: how have these hybrid networks influenced and developed the creation of culturally sustaining spaces? And so that's one of the things that I think is very important, especially as scholars and researchers, like when we do this work, you know, what kind of like competencies have we developed in order to engage and engage with these folks so we don't come from a deficit model, right? Where we don't come from like, well, they don't have computers at home, but how are they learning how to participate? They don't have this, they don't have that. And I think those are like the wrong questions to like approach a lot of these things with, right? You know, marginalized and minoritized populations are very savvy in their internet use and their technology use. And I think we should start there from where they are and see what their capacities are. And then we build out from that, right? Instead of coming straight from like, well, they don't have this, they don't have that, so surely they're not doing these things. When I was doing this project, like with gaming in the Appalachian region, you know, like up in the mountains of Appalachian, you know, kind of close to the West Virginia like border. And then there, of course, there are all kinds of assumptions about these poor white folks and what they don't have and what they can't do. But I'm like, that's just incongruent with their realities because they're still participating. They're still finding ways to connect. They're still finding ways to like engage. And I think those things need to be showcased, right? Another question: how do the culturally sustaining spaces impact how communities develop computational maker practices? Basically, how are they creating and they don't have anything? And this is where the reliance on mobile technologies actually is really significant in a lot of those spaces. I remember one of the events that I had, we took some Alienwares, like some of the gaming computers, and we couldn't run them, but we had phones. And so we had to just make do with like games like on the phone because there were some cell towers nearby. And so they were able to participate. So here I am having to like reimagine and refashion like this curriculum that we built out, but also having to be ready for those technological like challenges. And then we really created these really beautiful like experiences. Oh, my battery's low. Hold on, let me plug this in. Don't die. No. And that's where, you know, I started to like develop more savviness like around like the mobile games and the mobile apps. And that's why I hate when a lot of these companies take away these mobile experiences, because when they take away the mobile experiences, like for instance, like Fortnite, you remember the Fortnite Apple kerfuffle? So that actually impacted like a lot of like the connectivity that these young folks had, because they couldn't play Fortnite like on consoles. They were playing Fortnite and Call of Duty and all these games like on their cell phones. But then because of that issue that Apple was that a lot of the companies were having with the pay structure on these app stores, you know, that option was like taken away. What are the everyday activities informing youth's computational thinking and making practices? And then across these sites, what are the intersectional design principles influencing prolonged engagement with the culturally sustaining computational makerspaces? One of the projects that I'm working on right now here in Kentucky that actually fits with a lot of this work that I'm doing, they just recently uncovered some of the old segregated cemeteries. So where Black folks are, you know, formerly enslaved folks, but also just like, because I think cemeteries were mostly segregated, like up until like the 1970s and 80s, like in the country. And so many people's like loved ones like are buried in these spaces that they don't have access to, you know. So we've working with the cities, you know, we're clearing out the areas, cutting down like the trees, cutting down like the overgrowth, cleaning up, you know, we were just out there with like brushes and toothbrushes, like cleaning off like the headstones. But I also think that it's important that we digitize these kinds of things, you know, so folks who aren't able to go to that space, you know, can still interact and engage. But also it's like just a part of like, you know, archiving, you know, the memory and the knowledge and the histories, because so much of it is being lost and it's being like eroded. So some of these, so one of these young folks, like here in the schools that we're doing, they're trying to create like an AR experience, because some of the headstones are just so worn that we don't even know like who they are. So what they want to do is like whenever you go up to the cemetery and the headstone, you can kind of interface probably hopefully with a QR code, and then it pops up like who that person is. You can see it legibly, and then we're gonna go through the archives and go through like the databases like to find out like who these folks are, and connect them with like their families and reconnect them with like communities and stuff. So we're using AR, augmented reality, a lot for a lot of those experiences. But it's really beautiful what these kids will come up with, and that's why I don't come from this deficit model anymore. Like these kids are savvy and they have really beautiful ideas like to share in those spaces. That's more of like Pokemon Go stuff. Oh, here's some of that AR technology that we're enabling and teaching like the kids to use, and it's so many cool like technologies that we don't have to rely on somebody else to do this experience, to create the experiences for us. We can create them ourselves, and I think that's what's really beautiful. Let's see. I think that's okay. I've come to the end, and hopefully folks got something out of all that. Let me stop the share so I can see you all again. Let's see, where are you all? There you are. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. We do have a set of questions that I'm going to just start diving into. These are not in the order that they've been submitted, but just sort of popping around a little bit. Wondering, what are some guidelines that you could suggest to designers and researchers who aren't brown or black of social systems to become aware of minority experiences that are particularly underrepresented in mainstream media, so they can proactively design for these populations rather than doing it as an afterthought?
Oh my gosh, that's $1 million question, right? Oh gosh. I think one of the things that's important is to be intentional up front with audiences. That's why, part of the intersectional game design, I'm big about, the authentic experiences for who are you designing this for? And that's why, like I remember talking earlier with somebody and they said, well, I'm just designing it for anybody. That's just not true. We aren't just designing for anybody. So we have to really be intentional about when we're designing, who we're creating for, who can participate, who can't participate, who's going to be left out. And so we actually have to do that reflective exercise like early on. If we're like, well, I'm going to create this experience for this particular demographic, like just name that and claim that and own that, right? But if you're actually wanting to diversify like audiences and stuff, you're going to have to bring those folks to the table early on, right? You're going to have like listening sessions of where you ask people what historically has been your experience around this thing, right? And then you're going to have to like listen and not be how can I say this? Not be in your feelings a lot when people say these hard things to you, right? I remember working with this one company one time, and oh, bless them, their feelings kept getting hurt. They kept saying, well, they were saying that what we're doing is racist, and it's not racist. I'm like, okay, stop. Just ignore that they said that. I'm like, because I can spend more time to help you understand that part and that piece. But I think that's what stops so much of the work, right? Because communities, especially minoritized and marginalized communities, have experienced so much harm, and there's never been a place where we rectify that harm. So whenever they finally get into a space where they can speak and where they can advocate, a lot of times it might seem harsh of where they're giving you all of their grievances that they've had over a time. But I think as committed researchers and makers and doers like in this space, we have to just acknowledge like, yes, you've been excluded, we're trying to fix that, yes, we hear you, right? And so I think there you just have to just sit and listen and like take a lot in, because then you're going to find those flashes of really creation and innovation is going to come after they get that out, and then you can get to the work of like making and creating. But first you got to bring these folks to the table. And
Right.
if you don't have like a budget, first of all, I would say pay folks like in a consultant, kind of like manner. But if you don't, then just make and create the experiences with them, just like I did with those. Like, I'm not going to assume anything about like poor white folks like in Appalachia, because that's not my reality and that's not my experience. So I make the relationships with them. I go out there with them, even with their Confederate flags out front of their house. I'm going to go in there. We're going to play these video games, right? So I think there's a lot that goes on. Like oh my gosh, I remember going. Where was it at? Harlan County. I remember going to like this after school kind of program. And, you know, they had belt buckles with Confederate flags. The trucks had Confederate flags. And I'm like, all right, we're in it. This is it. I was like, but you know, I didn't feel like my life was in danger. I want to make sure that folks know that clear, because I had already made a relationship with the young folks and with their families and with their parents, and they knew I was there to help and to support. And so I think the relationship building is really like the core piece. If you got a relationship with folks, it's much easier to do a lot of this work. Yeah.
I'm synthesizing a couple of questions here, but there are a couple questions around, how much of this is methods and how much of this is awareness is maybe the thrust of it? Like, are there methods that we can be better teaching, or to what extent, you know, if you had to split your attention between the methods and just discussion and adding awareness in the game industry, you know, what's going to be the intervention that you think is going to help the most?
Ooh, so intersectional tech, I think, is in part a methods book, right? So I spent a lot of time talking about the challenges of like doing this work. And even in this body, like it's not easy, even though I'm Black and I do like a lot of research like on Black people, like these are not easy like conversations like to have, because I acknowledge and recognize like all of my institutional privilege, economic privilege. You know, I recognize that there are some differences here, right? And our lived experiences and realities like are not the same. So a lot of it, you know, has to just be intentional about who are you engaging with, right? And we got to do like, and it's part of like methods, right? So let's say you want to go and do some work on like young Black folks and how they learn technology. You know, what work have you done to understand, you know, what the realities are, what the stories are? Because this isn't brand new stuff. Nothing that we do is brand new. And I think that that's something that we have to like acknowledge. You might be approaching it like in a different way, but there are people who have done this and asked similar questions and done similar things. So let's go and do our homework and get up to speed on what the conversations are, so we don't go in these spaces and do more harm. Because a lot of academic institutions, they do a lot of extractive work. Let's be honest. A lot of what we do is very extractive. It's very exploitative, right? We're going inside these communities and inside these populations, and we're asking them for things to help with our research so we can pad our CVs and so we can build our bodies of research. And so I think it's important to like acknowledge, and that should be like a part of like the conversation like around methods. Like ethics should be embedded into every week that we do. It shouldn't just be, you know, week 2 where we kind of gloss over it and then we go into like the realness of it. The ethics is a part of like that real work as well. I also found that a lot of the methods were incongruent with what I with what I wanted to do and what I wanted to accomplish, right? So there's a part in intersectional tech where I talk a harm has happened to this Black man, and here I am. I'm wanting to ask questions. I'm wanting to engage in the researcher part, but I don't. I take a step back, and I'm just there, and then I offer support. I remember, you know, one of my advisors was like, you know, Kishonna, you should have asked the questions. I'm like, this ain't no tabloids here. Like, what you think we doing? You know, and that's why I was just like, I had to come up with, like intersectional design, basically to account for those kind of hierarchical structures and like practices inside our research methods. We had to go away from the positivist, you know, stuff like there are no biases, there are no assumptions. Yeah, there are. Yeah, like we shouldn't go into this thinking that none of those things exist. Yeah, they do, because we're human beings and we're going into spaces like with other human beings. Now, I remember there was also like a mentor that said, well, Kishonna, that's why I don't do humans. I'm like, what do you mean you don't do humans? I don't want to talk to humans. I just want to be over here with this technology because humans are too hard. I was like, okay, well, you just stay over there and I'll be over here. Because I think humans are actually fascinating. And I think if we talk to more humans, we could build better technologies and build better things if we spent more time with the humans. Yeah. I hope that helped.
Yeah. Next question is who's asking, even if we think tech products are designed for everyone, quote unquote, they're often tested on a specific majority demographic, and then there are ramifications for folks outside of that tested population. Are there any products or systems that you can think of that are directed or designed or tested for the quote unquote actual population of use, and specifically tech for minority groups?
Oh my gosh. I know a lot of things that have been designed without including minority groups, but specifically including minority groups. My goodness, I'm sure there are. Oh yeah, gaming gives us great examples. The adaptive controller, you know, especially to be more inclusive and more accessible, like with people who have like, you know, different disabilities and stuff, you know, different use of their hands. I remember doing interviewing they're called the Quad Gods. There's like a group of gamers, they're quadriplegic, and they talk about you know, just how costly it is to just participate in gaming, you know, because when they buy like a console, you know, they have it and then it comes with like, you know, the standard controller. You all know what like a controller looks like, but they can't use the controller, right? They can't use the traditional headset, right? You know, because they have, you know, very limited use of like their arms, very limited use of like their legs and stuff. And so they're talking about like the cost to just gain entry inside the console space, and all the attachments and all the things that they have to buy to just be able to talk and to be able to participate and be able to engage in that space. So there are some controllers that it's like third party stuff, right? I'm wanting that to be more of the norm in the OG experience. So like when you design this phone for me, I want to know, I don't want to have to go and add, you know, all kinds of things in order to just talk on my phone and use my phone. Whenever Apple makes the laptop for me, I don't want to have to go buy all these extra like attachments and things just to participate. So I think that we're getting there. I can't name anything outside of the adaptive controller that actually, you know, thought about, you know, thought about like accessibility, you know, either, you know, from like the standpoint of like disability or even like racial accessibility, which is what I talk about like in the classroom. Oh, y'all might be interested in this. I'm not a DEI person, but you know, folks of color, they'll throw us in the DEI space. So they threw me in this DEI space. And, you know, they wanted to say, you know, what do we need to be thinking about like in higher education and like in universities right now? And I said, well, you know, those letters of accommodation that disabled students get, right? I was like, we need to think about something similar when it comes to like racial accommodations. They're like, well, what do you mean? And I was like, well, we should like we should think about, you know, like if, because like I'm at the University of Kentucky. I'm not sure if you all remember last semester, one of our Black women workers in housing, she was accosted, called it N-word. Like it was a really awful, like, you know, kind of like experience for her. And then the next day, you know, the campus just went like back to normal. And I was like, you know, what kind of space did we take for like Black students and other students who were like negatively like impacted for that? And they're like, well, that's an individual thing that happened to that individual. I'm like, no. But we felt that collectively. We all felt that collectively. So in my mind, I'm like, you know, I think universities should like really come up with like, hey, this is like what the policy should be. If like this racial harm happened, we'll take the time and hold space. And this is where you can go if you need like help and support. They thought I was talking like another language altogether. I'm like, y'all ain't about that life anyways. Let me go on back to my research. Let me go back to my lab and play these video games because they wasn't about that life at all. I can't do DI. Anyway, next question. I'm sorry. I hope it didn't answer your question because I don't have examples. Hopefully somebody in this space can think of examples. Fashion is doing it. Like when I think about like Adidas is like bringing in like Black designers and stuff. You know, so I know like a lot of the fashion houses are intentional about bringing in like diverse designers, like to create different kinds of experiences. But when it comes to like technology, I can't think of any. I can't. Well, they're out. They got to be out there, right? They got to be out there. Like I'm if I think of something, I'll send them to you, Michael. You share.
Yeah. This also teaches us something that it's that hard. I think we're about at time. So why don't we wrap it here and thank Professor Gray for joining us and sharing her thoughts with us. Again, thank you so much. We'll give you silent Zoom claps, which is the most awkward thing, but you know, we'll do it anyway.
I love it. Thank you all. I appreciate you all so much.
Yeah, and thank you for spending part of your afternoon and your day with us.
Of course, I'm glad to.
Absolutely. See ya.